Hare Krishna, Jai Sri Radhe. The Vedas are a big enigma. What are they? How many are they? Who composed or compiled them? When were they composed? What is their theme? Such are the questions which crop up and have been avidly discussed for ages without anybody finding answers which would satisfy everybody. We shall now try to answer them here in this episode. The Vedas are, as their name suggests, a compendium of knowledge, a kind of encyclopedic multi-volume book of knowledge. But there are several vital differences between an ordinary book of knowledge or encyclopedia and the Vedas. The Vedas are the ancient-most. They are so ancient that nobody has been able to determine when, where, and how the Vedas originated. That is because they are divine. Orthodox tradition holds that the Vedas were taught by divinity to the first generation of sages, initiating a tradition of reciting them verbatim from generation to generation. People are prone to dismiss this as sentimental nonsense. But it must be considered, firstly, that the immutable divine origin of the Vedas is a firm tradition. Secondly, all efforts hitherto to trace the original source and the time of composition of the Vedas have totally failed. Thirdly, no two scholars agree on the meaning of the Vedas and their purpose, though most agree that the Vedas have a hoary antiquity and holy purpose. Let us therefore be clear about the fact that the Vedas constitute a divine book of knowledge of every aspect concerning the cosmos as it relates to and affects human life. It is usually said that there are only four Vedas, namely Rig Ved, Yajur Ved, Sam Ved, and Atharva Ved. The theory floated by Western scholars that these Vedas were composed in that order, one after the other at the interval of a few centuries each, about 3500 years ago, is completely at variance with orthodox Vedic tradition. According to tradition, the four Vedas constitute one composite integrated whole, handed down by divinity for verbatim oral recitation. But since the Vedas constitute the total book of knowledge, they included several additional volumes, appendices, enclosures, or auxiliaries such as Dhanurved and Ayurved, and many more. But during the course of nearly 2000 million years or 20 billion years of human history, several of those ancillary volumes were forgotten and lost. The Dhanurved is also almost totally lost, but the Mahabharata is usually assigned the status of the fifth Veda, and many Sanatani Hindu scholars would like to add Ayurveda to that list as the sixth Veda, and so on. We Sanatani Hindus have no hesitation in saying that divinity itself composed the Vedas because they are so comprehensive, so universally respected, so holy, so ancient, and so enigmatic that no human agency could compose them. Also, no human agency could enforce their hereditary recitation from generation to generation all the world over by abstemious and pious families leading a life of almost indigent destitution and total sacrifice of worldly ambitions. That miracle could not have been possible unless a compelling obedience is built in the Vedas themselves because of their divine origin. Has any publisher of any encyclopedia been able to create a system for the verbal recitation for ages by innumerable families worldwide without any remuneration, coercion, or temptation whatsoever? According to tradition, the Vedas constitute an eternal book of knowledge, which is a permanent part of divinity. It does not have to be composed. It is only to be handed over to humanity for hereditary recitation after every pralaya, means universal devastation. The theme of the Vedas is to explain to man the working of the material cosmos and how humanity should ordain its life to fit into the divine cosmic order. The technology which produces a manufactured product has to exist before the factory starts working. Similarly, the Vedas, which explain the technology of the infinite cosmos, constitute a pre existing part of eternal divinity. To try to date them is as futile as the attempt to fix the origin or date of the solar system or the electrons which constitute this universe. We may summarize the attempts made by several scholars to fix the age of the Vedas. Max Muller, the doyen of the Western school, whose faulty assumptions are being blindly followed by the West dominated academic world today, based all his calculations on the then prevalent blundersome assumption that the world was created in 4004 BC. His next faulty assumption was that the Vedas are a Brahminical work and the Brahmanas were some arrogant, domineering, exclusive, discriminatory community. Max Muller's third mistaken notion was that Buddhism was a revolt against Brahmanism. Max Muller's fourth mistake was to believe that the Buddha lived in the 6th century BC. The actual fact is that the Buddha lived in the 19th century BC. I have decided to make an entire episode in this regard in future. Max Muller's fifth blunder was to assume that the whole range of Vedic literature was composed by some rustic individuals in the following order, one after the other, like a busy publishing house. For example, the Rig Veda, Yajurveda, Samveda, Atharvaveda, the Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and Upanishads in a continuous long trail from about 1200 BC to the 6th century BC, just in time for the Buddha to be born at the time of the completion of that literary series to revolt against it all in great disgust. It is a pity that all the above blundersome assumptions form the bedrock of tuition conducted all over the West dominated academic system throughout the world. It is as wrong to describe Vedic culture as Brahmanism as it is to describe modern educational system as professorism, because professors exercise authority. Vedic culture was a fourfold system in which all its four components had their duties, functions, and standards of behavior properly demarcated. It is also wrong to look upon the Buddha as a rebel. Buddha was a devoted follower of Vedic culture. He abandoned his princely status and took to monkhood, exactly like many modern Indian yoga gurus who have established their own so-called ashramas and preaching their self-invented yoga philosophies which are completely against Vedic scriptures, civilization and culture, but still they are considered by common people as great Hindu gurus. For example, Isa Foundation in Tamil Nadu by Mr. Jagi Vasudev, a mentally deranged person. So Buddha did the same thing. His mind had lost interest in palace luxuries, and not because he detested Vedic culture. So he was also like a modern Indian rock star yoga guru. So, considering all these facts, Max Muller's faulty assumptions of his dating of the Vedas at 1200 BC at the earliest deserves to be discarded. Two other Western scholars, Whitney and Winternich, have condemned Max Muller's loose logic and have castigated other scholars who lauded Max Muller's surmises as unscientific deductions. Dr. Winternich pointed out that the style of language takes as many as 1,000 years to change and not just 200 as assumed by Max Muller. Consequently, Max Muller's estimate of the antiquity of the Vedas amounted to an undervaluation. Dr. Howe assumes the various stages of Vedic literature as fancied by Max Muller to be right, but allows a gap of 500 years instead of 200 as Max Muller, and concludes that the entire range of Vedic literature was composed by some individuals around 2400 BC to 2000 BC. But it needs to be pointed out to scholars of the Max Muller line of thinking that the whole basic idea in reciting the Vedas verbatim from generation to generation with meticulous emphasis on the intonation of every syllable and a careful mathematical count of the letters involved is to ensure that the pristine purity of Vedic wording may remain undefiled throughout the ages. Added to this, when one considers that the Rigved, Yajurved, Samved, and Atharvaved continue but one composite work, it is wrong to judge them as having been composed at different periods of time by some individuals. Vedic recitation tradition proves that Vedic wording has remained unchanged and that it continues to retain its purity as it was at the time of the creation. Trying to determine the age of the Vedas from their language is highly unjustified when it is realized that even in physical science, date estimates of different scientists are at great variance from one another. Thus, for instance, according to various geologists, 20,000 to 80,000 years have elapsed since the close of the last glacial epoch. Yet another scientist, Avinash Chandra Das, has presented two different estimates in two editions of the same book. In one edition, he asserts that the territory of Rajasthan was under the sea 60,000 years ago, while in another he says it was only 27,000 years ago. Considering such uncertainties even in physical sciences, a philological dating of the Vedas does not deserve any serious consideration. Moreover, it must be realized that the Vedic language, being neither mundane nor human, measuring its antiquity by human philological conjectures is highly improper. Therefore, summarizing some representative estimates of the date of the Vedas, a Vedic scholar, the late Balasaheb Hardas of Nagpur, pointed out in a public lecture series in the 1950s in Pune that Pandit Patankar of Rajapur believed the Vedas to be 21,000 years ancient on the basis of Jyotish Shastra, means astronomy. Another scholar, Mr. Lele, put the figure at 40,000 years. Pandit Sudhakar Dwivedi estimates the Vedas to be 54,000 years ancient. Pandit Krishna Sastri Godbole added another 18,000 years to that figure. Another scholar, Pandit Dinanath Chulet, believed the age of the Vedas to be 15 lakh years. Yet another scholar, Swami Dayananda Saraswati, founder of Arya Samaj organization, basing his calculation on the Yuga computation of the Vedic almanac, concluded that the Vedas were obtained over 1960 million years ago. So, all the spiraling speculations mentioned here seem to confirm the traditional view that the Vedas were conferred on humanity by divinity at the start of the universe, and that was millions and millions of years ago. Readers who shudder to think in terms of millions of years of antiquity may perhaps, at the very least, concede that the Vedas are of immeasurable antiquity. All the representative views I mentioned have generally banged on philological, geological, or astronomical data to arrive at the date of the Vedas, but we suggest an altogether different approach. We venture to suggest that the basic purpose of the Vedas provides a good clue. The question is, why at all were the Vedas furnished to humanity? What is their justification? The justification is that the maker of a complicated mechanism such as an automobile or a radio receiving set or a TV set invariably makes available to the user, alias the customer, a booklet explaining the working of that mechanism. That is our common experience. So, even when such comparatively insignificant mechanisms have a book explaining their working, does it not stand to reason that God Almighty, the maker of this complicated, limitless, timeless cosmos, realized his responsibility of furnishing to his customers and consumers, namely human beings, the book of knowledge, namely the Vedas, explaining this cosmos as forming the background of human activity and as to how humanity should conduct its life during earthly existence. Does not a consumer expect such preliminary and fundamental service and consideration from a responsible master manufacturer? How would divinity then fail in this primary duty? On the contrary, and the most funniest thing is, an overwhelming section of human opinion considers divinity to be omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent, merciful, and a very considerate Father of all. When such a divinity launches humanity in a cosmos of limitless infinity and immense complexity, it stands to reason to expect God as a benign father and also as the sole cosmic entrepreneur to furnish humanity with an expert and exhaustive guidebook. That guidebook, or the book of knowledge about the mechanism, purpose, and mode of use of this cosmos and about the role that humanity has to play in it, is known collectively as the Vedas. It is but natural in the above circumstances that the Vedas have to be kept ready for use by humanity from the very first generation. Therefore, we conclude that the Vedas were taught verbatim to the first generation of sages. Consequently, the age of the Vedas is the age of humanity. Let scientists and philosophers apply their own test to determine when man first set foot on this globe, and that will automatically give us the date of the availability of the Vedas to mankind. And it is precisely on this consideration that claims divinity of scriptures like the Bible and the Quran, apart from other considerations, totally fail. A guiding spiritual scripture must be ready for the very first human being. Humanity cannot wait for a freak, Jesus or a Muhammad or Baha'u'llah to appear at any random date, billions of years after human beings started living on this globe. But people usually lack courage to develop such a conviction. Consequently, they abandon logic and, in a spirit of political compromise, mention the Vedas, the Bible, and the Quran in the same breath, which is highly improper. Particularly, the Indian political prostitutes are pioneers in this regard. Some viewers might shudder to think of the Vedas as having been bestowed by divinity at the start of humanity and exclaim that such a miracle is impossible and inconceivable. To such people, we would like to say that when this entire limitless, highly complicated cosmos and human existence in it, from birth to death, constitute a series of endless miracles, what is wrong with the Vedas being one additional miracle? Divinity also has at its command various modes of creation for a variety of lives, from invisible germs to giant animals. Divinity can also destroy life in one sweep by an epidemic or flash flood, lightning, earthquakes, etc. With such an immense power potential, is it not possible for divinity to produce the first stock of adult humans ready-made to populate this earth for reproduction thereafter? Just consider how the meeting and mating of men and women creates an illusion of luscious romance, though its ingredients are all foul smelling. Factors like flame, blood, spittle, perspiration, urine, and excreta. Is that illusion not a miracle? In Vedic spiritual science, it is called Maya, means the illusory potency of the Supreme Lord. What to speak of human beings? Even Lord Shiva and Lord Brahma many times fall into this Maya's trap. Consider how a human life sprouts and is tended within the womb for over 9 months. Is that not a miracle? Visualize how myriads of lives are constantly dropping on the earth like rain from nowhere and being drained away into death and oblivion in an unending, relentless trail. When we have a divine mechanism capable of all such miracles, can it not as well furnish the world with a first generation of human beings well versed in the Vedas? The Vedas are a human heritage and not of the Hindus or of Bharat alone. The mere fact that the Vedas belong to all mankind proves that the world's basic faith is Vedic Aryanism, and that all human beings followed Vedic culture until they were divided first by Christianity and later by Islam. It is therefore necessary for all to cultivate and assimilate more and more knowledge about the Vedas.